If I told you that some of the earliest Christians did not believe what most Christians believe today, would you listen, or would you shut this video off immediately? Because the uncomfortable truth is this: Christianity did not begin with one Bible, one doctrine, or one unified understanding of who Jesus was. What we now call the New Testament is the result of centuries of selection, debate, rejection, and suppression. Entire books were excluded. Entire interpretations were declared dangerous. Entire voices disappeared, not because they were insignificant, but because they challenged authority. And among the voices that vanished, none is more controversial than that of Mary Magdalene. Today, most people know her only as a repentant sinner, sometimes incorrectly labeled a prostitute, quietly standing at the edge of the story. But that image is not found in the earliest Christian writings. It was constructed later, carefully, deliberately, at a time when the church was solidifying its hierarchy and deciding who was allowed to speak for Christ and who was not. What you are about to hear is not an attack on Christianity. It is not a declaration that the Bible is false, and it is not a claim that any forbidden text must be accepted as literal truth. What it is, instead, is a historical examination of beliefs held by some of the earliest Christians, beliefs that were later erased. And erased beliefs still matter. For the first 3 centuries after Jesus' death, there was no official Bible, no finalized New Testament, no single authority powerful enough to enforce universal doctrine. Christianity existed as a network of scattered communities stretching from Judea to Egypt, Syria, Greece, and Rome. Each community preserved the teachings it believed came from Jesus and his closest followers. Some relied heavily on the Gospel of Matthew. Others treasured sayings collections attributed to Thomas. And some followed teachings associated with a woman the canonical Gospels already place at the center of the resurrection story, Mary Magdalene. During this period, Christianity was illegal. Believers were persecuted, imprisoned, and executed. Possessing Christian texts could mean death, which makes one fact impossible to ignore. People do not risk their lives to copy and preserve writings they consider meaningless or false. The existence of these alternative gospels is proof that many early Christians believed deeply in what they contained. The turning point came centuries later, when Christianity gained power under the Roman Empire. Once belief transformed into institution, choices had to be made. Certain interpretations supported hierarchy, obedience, and centralized authority. Others did not. Texts that promoted personal revelation, spiritual equality, or uncomfortable power dynamics were no longer merely theological differences. They were threats. And so the process of exclusion began. For more than 1,000 years, we only knew of these forbidden writings through the angry descriptions of church fathers who condemned them. The texts themselves were believed lost forever, burned, destroyed, erased. Until 1945. In December of that year, near the town of Nag Hammadi in Upper Egypt, 2 local brothers were digging in the desert, searching for fertilizer. Their tools struck something hard beneath the soil. What they uncovered was a sealed clay jar, tall and narrow, buried near a cliff. At first, they were afraid to open it. Local superstition warned that sealed jars sometimes contained spirits. But curiosity won. Inside were 13 ancient codices, complete books, not fragments, bound in leather, untouched for more than 16 centuries. When scholars eventually examined the contents, the implications were staggering. More than 50 previously unknown Christian texts, written in Coptic, dated to the 2nd and 3rd centuries. These were not medieval legends or philosophical experiments. They were early Christian writings, some as old as, or older than, the texts that later formed the New Testament. Among them were works historians had heard of but never fully read: the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, and most explosively, the Gospel of Mary. These texts revealed a version of early Christianity that modern believers are rarely told about, one marked by diversity, debate, and competing claims to spiritual authority. And at the center of that struggle stood Mary Magdalene. To understand why this mattered, we need to talk about the people who preserved these writings. Today, they are grouped under the label Gnostic, a term that has become almost synonymous with heresy. But in reality, there was no single Gnostic church or unified belief system. What many of these communities shared was an emphasis on personal knowledge of God rather than obedience to institutional hierarchy. They believed spiritual authority came through revelation and understanding, not through rank. And perhaps most threatening of all, in many of these communities, women taught. Women preached. Women interpreted doctrine. Women held positions of spiritual authority. Mary Magdalene was not a problem in this environment. She was evidence. Even within the canonical Gospels, her role is already unusual. She is the first witness to the resurrection. In a patriarchal society where women's testimony carried little to no legal authority, that detail alone is stunning. The foundation of Christian faith, the resurrection, is entrusted to her voice. So the question is not why Mary Magdalene was important. The question is why her importance needed to be erased. Centuries after the resurrection, her reputation collapses. She becomes reimagined as a fallen woman, a sexual sinner, a figure in need of redemption rather than a bearer of revelation. Yet none of this appears in the earliest texts. It appears later, when her authority becomes inconvenient. History is not shaped only by what is remembered. It is shaped by what is forgotten, and who benefits from that forgetting. By the time church leaders began formally defining orthodoxy, Christianity had changed. It was no longer an underground movement. It was becoming a pillar of empire. Hierarchy mattered. Apostolic succession mattered. Power had to flow in a straight line, from Jesus to the male apostles, and from them to bishops. A tradition that portrayed Mary Magdalene as spiritually equal or even superior disrupted that structure. It raised dangerous questions. Questions about authority, about leadership, about who Jesus trusted most. And those are exactly the questions preserved in the texts that were banned. In the next part of this story, we will read the words that unsettled the early church so deeply that they tried to erase them completely. Words describing Mary Magdalene not as a side character, but as Jesus' closest companion. Words that depict jealousy among the disciples. Words that use a Greek term, koinonos, meaning partner, sharer of life, one bound in union. Those words were written, they were preserved, and they were hidden. And once you hear them, you will understand why. The text that unsettled the early church more than any other did not describe miracles or parables or prophecies. It described relationships. It is known today as the Gospel of Philip. Unlike the four canonical Gospels, Philip is not a narrative of Jesus' life. There is no birth story, no crucifixion scene, no resurrection account. Instead, it reads like a collection of reflections on spiritual union, on intimacy, and on who truly possesses authority. And in the middle of these reflections, a passage appears that centuries of church leaders would later wish had never survived. The manuscript says, plainly and without symbolism, that Mary Magdalene was not only close to Jesus, but closer than the others. And the companion of the Savior was Mary Magdalene. That single sentence already raises questions, but the text does not stop there. Christ loved her more than all the disciples and used to kiss her often on the mouth. The reaction of the disciples is recorded immediately afterward. The rest of the disciples were offended by it and expressed disapproval. They said to him, "Why do you love her more than all of us?" This is not poetic imagery. This is not abstract theology. This is a social moment, an interaction witnessed, judged, and challenged by others present. Jealousy does not exist in metaphor. Offense does not exist in allegory. These are human reactions to something observable. For centuries, attempts have been made to soften this passage. Some have argued that the kiss was symbolic, a transmission of wisdom. Others suggest it represented blessing, not affection. But the text does not say that. It describes a repeated action and a visible reaction. And the word that changes everything appears just before that description. Mary Magdalene is called the koinonos of Jesus. In ancient Greek, koinonos does not mean follower or student. It means partner, one who shares life, one who participates in union. The same word appears in other Greek writings to describe business partners, covenant partners, and in some cases, spouses. What makes this especially uncomfortable is that this term is not used for any male disciple. Peter is not called koinonos. John is not called koinonos. No one else is. Only Mary Magdalene. Later in the same text, the Gospel of Philip says something else that rarely receives attention. There were three who always walked with the Lord: Mary his mother, her sister, and Magdalene, who was called his companion. Always walked with him. Not sometimes. Not occasionally. Always. In a tradition built on the authority of 12 male apostles, this detail is explosive. If this text had survived unchallenged, it would have forced early Christians to ask a dangerous question: who actually stood at the center of Jesus' inner circle? To understand why this mattered so deeply, you have to remember the historical moment these texts were written in. By the 2nd and 3rd centuries, Christianity was no longer just a belief system. It was becoming an institution. And institutions require structure, chains of authority, clear lines of leadership. Power had to flow from Jesus to the apostles, and from the apostles to bishops. Any tradition that complicated that flow was a threat. A text that portrayed Mary Magdalene as the closest companion of Jesus didn't just elevate a woman. It reshaped succession itself. Because if Mary was closer than Peter, then Peter's authority was no longer absolute. And this tension does not appear only in the Gospel of Philip. It appears even more clearly in the Gospel of Mary. This text opens after Jesus' departure. The disciples are frightened, confused, and unsure how to continue without him. Mary Magdalene steps forward to comfort them and encourages them not to lose hope. She then begins to describe teachings she received privately from Jesus. The reaction is immediate. Peter challenges her. Did he really speak privately with a woman and not openly to us? Are we to turn about and listen to her? Did he really prefer her to us? This is not subtle. Peter is not arguing theology. He is arguing authority. He is asking why he should listen to a woman. He is asking why Jesus would speak to her privately. He is asking whether Jesus favored her above the male disciples. In other words, he is asking the same question the disciples asked in the Gospel of Philip. Why her? The response comes not from Jesus, but from another disciple, Levi. If the Savior made her worthy, who are you to reject her? Surely the Savior knows her very well. That is why he loved her more than us. Loved her more than us. Those words appear again. What these texts preserve is not just an alternative theology, but a raw glimpse into early Christian conflict. They show a movement struggling with something the canonical Gospels later smooth over: rivalry, insecurity, and disagreement over leadership. And at the center of that struggle stands Mary Magdalene, not silent, not repentant, not marginal, but authoritative. This portrayal stands in sharp contrast to what happens to her image in later centuries. By the time Christianity becomes aligned with imperial power, Mary Magdalene's authority has become dangerous. A woman who receives teachings directly from Jesus contradicts a patriarchal chain of command. A woman described as his closest companion destabilizes the narrative of male succession. So her role changes. She is merged with unnamed sinful women. She is sexualized and diminished. Her intimacy with Jesus is recast as moral failure rather than spiritual closeness. And eventually, she is reduced to an object lesson, not a leader. This transformation is not accidental. It happens at the same time church councils are deciding which texts are acceptable and which are heretical. The Gospels that elevate her are excluded. The interpretations that empower her are condemned. And the image that remains is safe, controlled, and non-threatening. But the earlier texts still exist, buried in sand, waiting, and they raise a question no later doctrine fully answers. If Mary Magdalene was merely a follower, why do so many early texts go out of their way to defend her authority? Why do they portray male disciples questioning her and being corrected? And why does jealousy appear so consistently, from Peter in one gospel to the unnamed disciples in another? People only feel threatened by those who stand close to power. The Gospel of Philip and the Gospel of Mary do not prove that Jesus was married. That conclusion goes beyond what the evidence can support. But they prove something else just as unsettling. They prove that some of the earliest Christians genuinely believed Mary Magdalene stood at the center of Jesus' spiritual world, closer than the others, trusted more than the others, and possibly bound to him in ways later generations preferred not to define. In the next part, we will step outside the texts themselves and ask what archaeology, early church writers, and alternative Christian traditions suggest about this belief, and why the institutional church ultimately moved so aggressively to bury it. Because what was erased was not just a story, it was a challenge to power. Once the forbidden texts are acknowledged, a new question immediately follows, and it is far more dangerous than the first. If some of the earliest Christians believed Mary Magdalene stood at the center of Jesus' inner circle, then traces of that belief should exist beyond these banned Gospels. And they do, not as proof, not as certainty, but as echoes. Outside the New Testament, early Christian writers mention groups that held views later condemned as heresy. One of them was Hippolytus of Rome, writing in the 3rd century. He describes a sect sometimes called the Gnostics, a group obsessed with hidden wisdom, who taught that spiritual authority flowed through a sacred union. In their tradition, Mary Magdalene was not a peripheral figure. She was central, a bearer of divine insight passed directly from the Savior. Hippolytus did not invent this claim. He recorded it to refute it, which matters, because people do not angrily refute ideas that no one believes. Then there is archaeology. In 1980, a tomb was uncovered in the Talpiot neighborhood of Jerusalem. Inside were several ossuaries, or bone boxes, bearing inscriptions. Among them were Jesus, son of Joseph, Mariamene e Mara, and Judas, son of Jesus. Immediately, controversy erupted. Some scholars argued that Mariamene was a rare form of Mary associated in some ancient texts with Mary Magdalene. Others rejected this outright. Statistical arguments clashed with historical skepticism. Documentaries sensationalized. Academics pushed back. What matters here is not whether the Talpiot tomb proves anything. It doesn't. What matters is that the idea itself did not come out of nowhere. The suggestion that Jesus might have had a family did not shock the ancient world. It shocks modern audiences far more than first-century ones. In Jewish culture at the time, marriage was normal, expected. Celibacy was the exception, not the rule. The canonical Gospels never say Jesus was married, but they also never say he was not. And silence cuts both ways. Paul, writing earlier than any Gospel, casually mentions that the apostles, including Peter, traveled with believing wives. He presents this as ordinary, not extraordinary, which raises a question historians are careful not to answer too quickly. If marriage was common among early Christian leaders, why is Jesus' status left undefined? The Gnostic texts offer one answer. The canonical silence offers another. Between them lies uncertainty, and uncertainty is something institutions dislike. By the late 4th century, that uncertainty had to be resolved. In the year 367 AD, Bishop Athanasius issued a letter listing the 27 books that would become the New Testament. Everything else was excluded, not debated, not footnoted, excluded. More than a century later, Pope Gelasius would formally condemn texts like the Gospel of Philip by name, labeling them apocryphal, hidden away. That word is revealing. Apocryphal does not originally mean false. It means concealed. For centuries, possession of banned texts was dangerous. In some regions, it was deadly. Manuscripts were burned, libraries destroyed, competing interpretations erased. And yet, not all traces disappeared. Legends persisted in unexpected places. In southern France and parts of Britain, medieval traditions claimed that Mary Magdalene fled Jerusalem after the crucifixion, that she carried sacred lineage, that she taught, healed, and preserved secret knowledge. Are these legends historical? No one can say, but legends do not survive for centuries without roots of belief. What all of this leaves us with is not a conclusion, but a boundary. Here is what we can say with confidence. The canonical Gospels do not confirm that Jesus was married or had children. The Gnostic texts do not explicitly state that he did. Anyone who claims certainty on either side is lying. But here is what cannot be denied. Some of the earliest Christians genuinely believed Mary Magdalene was more than a follower. They believed she was the closest companion. They believed she received teachings others did not. They believed her authority rivaled, and sometimes surpassed, that of the male disciples. And that belief was dangerous, not because it challenged faith, but because it challenged power. Once Christianity became aligned with empire, hierarchy became sacred. Authority had to be orderly, predictable, male. Anything that threatened that structure, especially the elevation of a woman, was seen not simply as incorrect, but as destabilizing. So the texts that preserved those beliefs were removed, not quietly, not accidentally, but systematically. What survived was an edited tradition, not fabricated, but refined. A tradition that emphasized unity, obedience, and apostolic succession. What was lost was Messiah, more human, more contested, and perhaps that is the most unsettling realization of all. Faith did not begin as a finished product. It began as a conflict. So when people ask the final question, did Jesus have a wife and child? The most honest answer remains the same. We don't know. But history does not require certainty to matter. What matters is understanding that the Christianity we inherited was shaped by choices, and that those choices were made by people operating within specific political, cultural, and institutional pressures. Knowing that does not destroy faith. It deepens it, because truth is not fragile. It survives scrutiny, and the closer you look, the more clearly you begin to see that silence in history is rarely accidental. It is authored. If you've stayed with this investigation until now, you already understand something most people never stop to consider. The Bible you read today is not fake, but it is edited. And there are still watchers, still guardians of forgotten texts, still questions buried beneath centuries of tradition. That is what this channel exists for. This is Kingdom Watch Network, a place where suppressed history is examined without fear, where forbidden texts are read instead of mocked, and where power is questioned rather than assumed. If you want to explore the other books they buried, subscribe to Kingdom Watch Network. Next episode, we examine the gospel where Judas is not portrayed as a traitor, but as the only disciple who truly understood Jesus' mission. Watch closely, because the kingdom is always watched, and the truth is rarely comfortable. May wisdom guide your searching. May discernment guard your heart. And may you never fear truth, no matter where it is found. Peace be with you, and may the light always find you.